Hello dear friends, you are watching the Ruslan Belov channel, and this is the daily summary of combat operations from the Ukrainian front. Today's episode is not the usual one. This is our monthly report, which we do once a month. That means we'll review the results for the previous month, in this case for October. We'll see where and how the front lines moved, how many kilometers were gained, and what the key figures look like for the month. But before we turn to the numbers, let's briefly go over the current situation on the Pokrovsk direction, because there are some major updates there. On the Pokrovsk axis, there are changes and new reports coming in. Let's start with the changes. All residential districts in the southern part of Pokrovsk have been completely cleared and are now fully under Russian control. These are the Lazurny, Shakhtarsky and Solnechny districts. Earlier, Lazurny came under Russian control, while fighting continued in Shakhtarsky and Solnechny. Today, both have been completely secured by Russian forces, and the entire line of contact now looks as follows. All the territory up to the Defenders of Ukraine Road has come under Russian control. It is also reported that Russian troops have significantly expanded their control zone in the settlement of Rog. In fact, the entire central part is now encircled, and clearing operations are underway across this area. As for the Russian advance, yesterday Russian units were confirmed to be on the northern outskirts of this settlement, and all the territory marked in red has now come under Russian control. It is also reported that along Schmidt Street, specifically to the west of the recently captured area, active fighting continues. It was from this point that a new video emerged. Ukrainian elite special forces had landed there, apparently to occupy positions and possibly even approach the Pokrovsk monument to take photos. Miraculously, the helicopter was not destroyed, but all the troops were completely eliminated by FPV drones. The Ukrainian side suffered heavy losses among its elite personnel. More than 10 soldiers were killed. Yesterday, new videos appeared confirming that Russian forces completely wiped out the group. It remains unclear what Zelensky, Syrsky, and the head of intelligence were counting on when they sent their troops into such a slaughter. Interestingly, the Ukrainian internet segment is completely silent about the operation. Neither Deep State nor other Ukrainian channels are saying anything. Total censorship of information. It seems they hope to distract attention from the daily stream of negative reports coming from the front. But people can see that Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad have only a few days left, and after them will come Kostiantynivka and Kupiansk. The situation on the Dnipropetrovsk direction also looks bleak. There has been no optimism for Ukraine from the front lines for a long time, and so they decided to take a desperate gamble, which ended in yet another disaster. Of course, no one will be held accountable for this failure. Since the start of the war, the Ukrainian armed forces have carried out a huge number of such media special operations. Repeated attempts to land troops in Crimea, operations on the islands near Kherson, and the infamous Krinky operation, where more than several thousand Marines were lost for the sake of publicity, all without any tangible result. Zelensky, eager for praise from London and Brussels, is ready to bury as many soldiers as it takes. And naturally, this story will teach no one any lessons. Today, the Russian Ministry of Defense also reported that Ukrainian forces made another identical attempt at an airborne landing. And once again, the entire landing group was destroyed. No photos or videos of this new attempt have appeared. That's all for today from Pokrovsk. Those are the latest updates and changes. Now let's take a look at the results for October. I'll say right away, the numbers are strong. In terms of total area captured, October ranks second for the year, and in terms of the number of settlements taken, it was the best month of the year. Let's move south to north, starting with the Kherson region. Yes, in October the Russian army made some progress there. It wasn't large, but still greater than in the Sumy region. The advance took place on the left bank, near the Antonovsky Bridge, or more precisely east of it, between the highway and the railway tracks. Ukrainian forces managed to push back slightly in some areas, but Russian troops took control of several summer cottage zones. It was essentially an exchange of small territories, but in favor of the Russian side. The Ukrainians managed to reclaim less than 1 square kilometer, while the Russians gained over 7 square kilometers. That's all for the Kherson region. Moving on to the Zaporizhia region, This is where October brought very solid results across multiple sectors. On the Stepnohirsk-Primorske line, no major changes were observed. In Stepnohirsk itself, there was no notable progress, but near Primorske, Russian forces managed to push toward the village center. That's about it there. It's a difficult sector, so large movements are rare. I can already say that in November, we probably won't see major progress there either. A more active situation developed near Kharkiv. This previously stagnant section came alive in October, though briefly. There weren't daily assaults throughout the month, but rather one effective offensive that improved Russian positions. As a result of that attack, Russian troops advanced about 2 kilometers near Novoandriivka and another 2 kilometers near Novodanilivka. Near Malotokmachka, the situation was mixed. Inside the village, Russian troops made some progress, but on the outskirts, Ukrainian forces managed to push back slightly. Still, the most productive direction was clearly the Hulyapol axis. There, Russian troops achieved consistent daily progress. The front line advanced over a stretch more than 20 kilometers wide. The depth of advance varied. In the north, the front moved 9 kilometers over the month, elsewhere 4 to 5 kilometers. By the end of the month, Russian forces had reached the final Ukrainian defense line along the Yanchur River. They secured all settlements on the eastern bank and even crossed the river, capturing a village on the western side. In total, fighters of the Vostok group took 8 settlements. Overall, in the Zaporizhia region during October, the Russian army gained control of more than 120 square kilometers, precisely 120.9 square kilometers. Now moving on to the Dnipropetrovsk region. Here too, the army achieved significant success. To give perspective, the pace of advance in the Dnipropetrovsk region in October ranked second, behind only the Donetsk region. Most of the success came in the operational zone of the Vostok group. On some sections, the depth of advance reached more than 15 kilometers in a month. The Russians captured 9 settlements, 8 of which were taken by the Vostok group and 1 by the Center group. The Center group took the village of Ivanivka, as the Novopavlivka sector is under its responsibility. Meanwhile, the Vostok group captured the villages of Alexeyevka, Novoalexandrovka, Verbov, Vishneve, Kirpichne, Yegorivka, Privolye, and Pervomaiske. And now, as we enter the month of November, fighting continues for 2 villages, Danilivka and Hai. I am confident these villages will come under the control of the Russian army within the first days of November. In fact, there were already reports claiming that Hai is under Russian control. In total, over 126 square kilometers in the Dnipropetrovsk region came under Russian control in October. Now let's move on to the Donetsk region, traditionally the area with the most significant advances. That's largely because there are more front sectors here. For example, in the Dnipropetrovsk region, the main front is the Pokrovsk direction, named after the town of Pokrovsk itself. There's also a secondary sector near Novopavlivka, and that's it. But in the Donetsk region, there are 5 main directions: Pokrovsk, Dobropilya, Kostiantinivka, Siversk, and Lyman. So 5 sectors of active combat. Let's start with the Pokrovsk direction. Here, as you know, major progress was achieved in October. On the 1st of October, Russian positions were only on the southern outskirts of the city. At that time, Russian troops controlled just a couple of residential neighborhoods, nothing more. Now, however, 4 multi-story districts are under Russian control: Lazurny, Solnechny, Shakhtersky, and Yuzhny, roughly 100 apartment blocks in total. Russian forces now hold part of the eastern outskirts of Pokrovsk, including the suburban villages of Hnativka and Ro. The entire western part of the city, including the industrial zone, is also under Russian control. In the city center, Russian troops are holding strong positions, forming several small pockets. They also control the entire Zheleznodorozhnaya Street, which runs across the city from west to east. Currently, Russian forces are actively securing positions in the northern sector. They have taken the industrial zone, physically cutting off all supply routes. From there, they have begun advancing into the Donetsk area, seizing parts of the private housing district. The Ukrainian exit corridor has now shrunk to just 2.5 kilometers, even less, around 2 kilometers and 200 meters. It has effectively turned into a shooting range. Through such a narrow corridor, the Ukrainian armed forces cannot retreat. It seems obvious to everyone that unless something truly extraordinary happens, the Russian army will finish the Pokrovsk operation in November. Once Pokrovsk falls, Mirnorad will inevitably follow. There was also solid progress there in October. Russian troops captured 3 suburban villages, entered Mirnorad itself, seized a mine, and cleared the northern mine zone before pushing into the city. The pace there is not rushed, but there is no need. Once Pokrovsk collapses, Mirnorad will fall automatically. The city is already in a de facto cauldron, surrounded on all sides. A 2-kilometer-wide corridor can hardly even be called an exit. In the Rodinska area, Russian troops nearly encircled the town in October, but didn't complete the operation. There were reports that it was captured, but no confirmations or verified footage followed. So that success will likely appear in the November summary. Realistically, by the time we review the next statistics, around the 1st or 2nd of December, we may well see 3 cities added at once: Pokrovsk, Mirnorad, and Rodinska. The chances are quite high. The situation on the Dnipropetrovsk front was difficult. Both sides, Russian and Ukrainian, made minor advances, but without major territorial shifts. Despite all the statements from Ukrainian media, Russian forces retook the village of Dnipropetrovsk and spent the entire month attempting to capture Kharkiv. Contrary to claims from some military bloggers, that attempt did not succeed. Thus, the situation on the entire Dnipropetrovsk salient remains extremely complicated and is likely to stay that way through November. I expect a month of back-and-forth fighting without decisive breakthroughs. Between the Dnipropetrovsk front and Kostiantynivka, the line remained mostly static throughout October. But on the Kostiantynivka direction, the key event occurred. Russian forces entered the city. Not only did they enter, but they managed to establish a foothold in the private housing sector, reaching as far as the tram depot. Honestly, I did not expect or predict that troops would enter Kostiantynivka already in October. I thought the city would remain surrounded for now, but the Ukrainian defense proved weak, and the Russian army decided to strike through. And they did. In addition, in October, Russian troops captured the village of Pleshchayevka near Kostiantynivka and improved their positions near the Klebanbek reservoir. The front also advanced steadily on the Siversk direction. Over October, Siversk was nearly encircled in a semicircle. Russian forces captured the villages of Dronivka, Vyemka, Kuzminivka, and Fedorivka. They also entered Zvanivka and reached the southern outskirts of Siversk itself. It's clear that in November, the Russian army will tighten the encirclement and cut logistics routes. It's even possible that Russian troops could enter the city. I would not rule that out. If supply roads are cut, entry into Siversk will be inevitable. The situation was even more favorable for Russian forces on the Lyman front. In Yampil, progress stalled, and the settlement couldn't be fully secured by month's end. But further west, large areas were liberated. The railway line was cut, and Russian troops made a push toward the Lyman-Siversk highway, which is now under heavy fire control. Russian forces made an 8-kilometer advance toward Lyman, even entering the city and seizing around 20 private houses. North of Lyman, they continue pressing forward, trying to encircle the area. On the western flank, Russian units attempted to envelop Drobyshev and are now fighting for Novoselivka. Overall, prospects for November look positive. The main focus will likely be advancing toward Lyman from the north and cutting 2 key supply routes, the Lyman-Siversk Road and the Sloviansk-Lyman Road. We'll see how that develops. Summing up the Donetsk region, in October, the Russian army captured more than 240 square kilometers of territory and 16 settlements. Now we move to the Kharkiv region. There were 3 main fronts of combat here in October: the Kupiansk front, the Melov bridgehead, and the Vovchansk sector. On the Kupiansk front, Russian forces advanced on both the right and left banks of the river. On the left bank in particular, they pushed the front line by more than 10 kilometers in a month, capturing Stepovo Novoselivka, Pishchane, and entering Kurilivka. In Kupiansk itself, a cauldron was formed in the center of the city's right bank part. The Yubileyny high-rise district was cleared, the entire southern part of the settlement was secured, and Russian troops reached the village of Sadov. the Ukrainian armed forces made one attempt to counterattack using 2 infantry fighting vehicles. As shown on the maps, they reached positions near Holubivka, where both vehicles were destroyed and the troops dispersed into the tree lines. That was the end of their effort. At the Melov bridgehead, Russian troops also achieved solid progress for that sector. They captured the villages of Otradne and Bologivka and improved their positions while attempting to connect the front line. On the Vovchansk direction, Russian forces captured the village of Tike and, most importantly, cleared the entire western part of the city. They also significantly strengthened their positions in the Tatarsky forest and reached Sinelnikove. Summing up the results for the Kharkiv region, in October, the Russian army took control of more than 110 square kilometers and 7 settlements. And finally, the Sumy region. There's hardly anything to discuss. The Russian army captured only about 1.5 square kilometers. In total, during October, Russian forces took control of 610 square kilometers of territory and 40 settlements. As I mentioned earlier, this ranks second for the year in terms of territorial gains, behind only September and only by a small margin of 25 square kilometers. However, in terms of the number of settlements captured, October was the best month of the year. Surprisingly, the 2 autumn months, September and October, showed much higher rates of advance than the 2 summer months, June and July. Who would have thought that autumn would outperform summer? Truly remarkable. Well, that's all for today's situation report from the front.